it's cheaper to buy a product that you saw on Instagram than it is to see a specialist that costs $2,000. People will always naturally take matters into their own hands when medicine fails them.
What does it actually cost to get taken seriously when you're in pain? For the average woman with vulvovaginal or pelvic pain in the US, it's about $18,000 a year paid entirely out of pocket. Welcome back to the world's tightest community. I am your host, Mathilde, and my guest today is Carmen Rising, a Brooklyn-based writer whose reporting on vulvovaginal pain has recently run in the New York Times and The Guardian. She came to this as a patient herself, and in this episode we get into the real economics of chronic pelvic pain, why the insurance system fails these conditions almost by design, and how an unregulated wellness industry has rushed in to fill the gap medicine left wide open. I was so grateful to go into even more detail on the topics Carmen raised in these articles because I think she offers a really sharp structural critique of what happens in the wake of the immense void that's left when people with vulvovaginal pain don't get access to the care they need. Enjoy the episode. Carmen, welcome.
Thank you.
I always think like the most interesting question nobody asks a journalist who's covering this particular area is how they got there personally, not professionally. So I'm curious what first pulled you into this world and covering the topic that you do.
Yeah, I started by being a patient. That was my personal interest in this world. I think I have a very similar patient story to a lot of people. I always struggled with pelvic pain and vulvovaginal pain, and I think it took me almost 10 years to get a proper diagnosis. And it was a very rocky and expensive journey. And so eventually, when I decided that I wanted to do journalism and I ended up going back to school, I kind of felt like I was sitting on this mountain of information just from personal experience. And I felt like I kind of had to get an honorary MD in vulvovaginal pain that I didn't want to get. and and I felt like there wasn't a lot of reporting on it. And so part of it was like, I felt like I had a duty to be like, well, I have this interest in this skill, and then I have this mountain of information. So I'm just going to combine the two. And that's now here I am.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we have people like you because I completely agree. There's way too little reporting and like focus in the mainstream on vulvovaginal and pelvic pain. And so just a huge kudos to you for, you recently published 2 pieces, one in the New York Times and one in the Guardian, no biggie, that kind of both dig into, I think from my perspective, like what happens when the system fails women with these conditions. And I think what connects them is this idea of the vacuum that emerges. What actually happens when research, funding, and regulation basically all fail. And in the New York Times piece, you cover the vaginal wellness industry kind of stepping in to sell solutions. And then in the Guardian piece, it's about the sheer economic burden that women carry just trying to get basic help. And I would love to start there with the Guardian piece. And you open the article by quoting research that estimates that women in the US experiencing vulvodynia incur a total cost averaging around $18,000 a year. So let's start by unpacking that number. What is actually driving that immense economic burden that women face?
Yeah. One study that I also linked is that the annual calculus of the economic burden of vulvodynia lands somewhere between 31 and 72 billion a year. And that study was done in 2012. So it's probably a much more enormous number now, but there's not a more recent study that I could have referenced. And so there's a lot of things that add up to that number. And I think the biggest one is just diagnostic delay. So it's everything that goes into getting a diagnosis and what that entails. So if it's, for example, somebody is going to a minimum of 3 appointments. I think it's usually a lot higher. I've talked to experts in this space who, specialists who people see on average like 8 providers before they get to a specialist. So if
Yeah.
you think
Wow.
about everything that goes into going to, say, 8 doctor's appointments, it's time off of work, it's
Mm,
commuting, it's parking, it's copays, it's research, so all of those things are in that calculus of economic burden.
mm,
So it's hard medical costs. So that can be, again, the cost of a literal appointment or a treatment that doesn't work. Like, say, you're prescribed some sort of, cream or pill that is like not what you actually need, but you're still paying for it.
mm,
And then everything that goes to everything happening in your life or your lifestyle that has to accommodate how much effort you're putting into going to all these appointments. So a lot of that economic burden is just the diagnostic delay and everything that you're doing in order to find that diagnosis.
mm.
So, which I find incredibly fascinating and incredibly pertinent to a lot of patients with vulvovaginal pain because not only are you often seeing your OBGYN, but maybe you're trying out a dermatologist or you're trying out, an endocrinologist, or you're also, I don't know, trying acupuncture, you're trying anything, and all of that is an economic burden.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that is where that number starts. And then to add on top of that, if you actually are lucky enough to find a diagnosis and possibly a specialist, usually, especially in the United States, a lot of vulvovaginal pain specialists operate outside of insurance. So the cost of the appointment and all of your treatments going forward are you're paying cash. So that's adding to these numbers like $18,000, $15,000, $24,000. I was interviewing patients where the numbers that I would quote for each patient were just starting from like specialist fees. So, I think for example, in the story, I highlight a woman named Stephanie Berman who started a mutual aid project. And I think that she estimated that she spent almost $40,000. Well, that number is coming from once she actually got a diagnosis. So I think of this as like multiple layers of that, like where that $70 billion number can come from. But I think that diagnostic delay is where the bulk of that expense is really like hitting
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned there in the start, it took
people.
you 10 years to get a accurate diagnosis, was it?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we both know, I mean, as you allude to, the need to kind of be the person who drives it forward and asking to see new specialists and like doing all the research and
Mhm.
trying this, that, and the other because there often isn't the one person who can actually like signpost you to the area of specialty that makes the most sense for you at the moment. So there's so much of that trial and error, which is just incredibly costly.
It's very costly because if you think about, even if you're not often like there's not a dollar the amount that you're paying to say do that research, that's still time away from what? Is it time away from work, hobbies? Like there's such a life not just an economic burden, but a quality of life burden that goes with that. And so I think you can really factor all that into the economics of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I wanted to zoom in on the insurance side because
Mhm.
in the article you quote Dr. Rachel Rubin, who describes the insurance system as, and I like this, a dumpster fire of brokenness.
Yeah,
What
that's a
can
great
we?
quote.
Yeah, it is a great one. Can we start unpacking? Like, what are some of the problems there, and how is it affecting like the individual woman who's seeking care?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I get it. A lot of the reason that a lot of specialists operate outside of the insurance system is because our insurance system is a joke. I mean, it doesn't take vulvovaginal pain seriously. So, and that has a couple of layers to it. So, one, insurance often, delineates how long an appointment can last. Usually that's around 15 minutes. So, basically what that means is that if you're in maybe a larger hospital system or a larger institution, you just churn out patients super quickly and the volume of patients is how you can make enough money to keep the lights on through the
Mm,
insurance system.
mm,
So for patients that have, complex vulvovaginal pain that maybe have a lot of moving parts that are, you're dealing with a lot of, whether it's hormonal, muscular, multiple conditions operating at once, a lot of times, like, who can diagnose that in 15 minutes?
mm,
So I know, like, that's one major factor of the insurance system that is not on the side of vulvovaginal pain. And then secondarily, there's sometimes not even like reimbursement codes. So what that means kind of in lay terms is that when a I guess practitioner, I'm not an insurance expert, by the way. This is
yeah.
just like me
I
as a
won't hold you
normal
to it.
person trying to like understand also the insurance system here.
I think we all
But
are.
yeah, exactly. Um, so everything, every kind of like diagnosis or thing that somebody's doing in an appointment has a code that they bill to insurance, where it's sort of like, if you have an ear infection and they're just like, okay, ear infection, I prescribe antibiotic, there's just a code that matches that so the insurance knows how to bill for that particular ailment. So there's certain things in vulvovaginal pain where there just literally isn't a code. Like there isn't something that you can bill. So because they don't think that the condition is real or it hasn't been studied enough. So
Mm,
and that's even just within vulvovaginal pain in gynecology and urology kind of more broadly. A lot of women's health, like a hysterectomy, is one of like the lowest reimbursement rates of all surgeries. So it's
mm,
sort of like basically like you can make more money as a doctor by doing a knee replacement than you can as a doing a hysterectomy. So a lot of it is just what our insurance companies value in health because they don't think these um, conditions are worth paying for, or they just don't think they exist. So if you think about it, like if you're a specialist being like, okay, I'm diagnosing like lichen sclerosis, or I'm diagnosing, hormonally provoked vestibulodynia, and there's like no, and like there's nothing to bill for that to insurance because they don't
yeah.
think it's real. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of layers as to why it's a dumpster fire of brokenness.
Yeah. When I was in the UK, where I was living up until fairly recently, I had so many disputes with my insurance company. And one of them was that once I had gotten the diagnosis of vulvodynia, which took some time, which in hindsight maybe should have been more accurately termed as like hormonal vestibulodynia or provoked
Hmm.
vestibulodynia. But the insurance company would not cover any more care beyond that point because it was regarded to be chronic pain condition, which
Hmm.
is interesting. I was talking to a guest of mine a few episodes ago about this term of chronic versus persistent pain because in when you hear chronic pain, it often comes with a connotation that there's nothing that you can do, which
Hmm.
we know, like, even though the research on treatments for different types of vulvar pain is lagging a lot, it isn't true that there's nothing that you can do to
Right.
try to address the pain, right? So it's this horrible catch of, getting the diagnosis is a prerequisite to getting care, but then you also kind of get penalized for getting a diagnosis because it doesn't cover you further, or that
Hmm.
was at least the case for me. So yeah, there's so many layers of challenges in accessing care, not only in the US, but also in the UK, for instance, where I was.
Completely, completely.
Um, and in your article, you also highlighted grassroots efforts like Tightlipped, which I know you're also a part of, and
Hmm.
the Aziza project, which you just referenced. They are doing amazing work, right? But it's also, I think, devastating when you put the numbers next to each other because I think you quoted in the piece that the Aziza project, which is this amazing project by Stephanie Berman to try to bring patients who can't afford care under this particular doctor, Dr. Corey Babb, to actually raise funds to be able to support and cover at least some of those costs for seeing him. They've covered just over $8,000 across 4 patients, which is
Hmm.
brilliant. But if you compare that to the $31 billion to $72 billion problem, like It's just devastating, I think. Like, what do you take away from that gap? And is there anything in your reporting that you've done so far that kind of makes you hopeful about eventually closing that gap at scale rather than on a patient by patient basis?
That's an amazing question. Yes, it does devastate me. I think, like, just first of all, I mean, and that's why I do this, because I think it's heartbreaking and it's so unnecessary, that a grassroots organization like the Aziza Project even has to exist. And I think that, and yeah, I mean, it's amazing to see somebody really try to tackle this like $1 at a time. But as you said, it's enormous. So I think I mean, the only way to close that gap is to have, basically, I think, do kind of what Tightlipped is doing, which is that this is a systemic problem that is not something that one person with a mutual aid project can fix, or, anyone. And even like, it's not sustainable for all women or all people with vaginal pain to pay for expensive specialists. Like, that can't be the answer to this problem. It has to be that you have to be able to go to a general practitioner or a gynecologist and get answers. So I think it's a education gap is the number one thing, is like, this has to be like the basics of, vulvovaginal pain have to be taught at a larger scale to more disciplines. And, I'm not sure about Europe or the UK, but in the US, medical school is very siloed and people kind of just stick to their lane. And vulvovaginal pain is a very multidisciplinary problem. And so I think the education gap is an enormous part of how this is solved, in my opinion. And residents and medical students just have to know the basics. And I think even starting with like, you can have pain in this part of your body is like a 101 concept for like all doctors.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't think there's a way to, and then there's also like, I mean, it's a can of worms, because part of it is that, like, the United States just doesn't in general have an accessible healthcare system. We don't have universal healthcare. We just don't have affordable resources for any type of care, like even beyond vulvovaginal pain. And so I think that, part of this is just like a larger issue about how a for-profit medical system works that would have to be solved at the policy level. But I do think at a minimum, if more general practitioners and gynecologists understood the basics of vulvovaginal pain, I think that $70 billion problem would start to decline.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And in your article, you also highlight
Mhm.
an opinion from Elizabeth Hintz, who raised something that I think is really important. She raised the risk that this ends up looking like a wealthy white woman's problem.
Mhm.
Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, one, it is because, like, as she points out, who can pay $2,000 for an appointment? What demographic of people are able to do that? Like, even myself, I look at like, okay, I was only able to see a specialist for $2,000 because my white male husband is a software engineer. Well, that also can't be the answer for everybody. So I think that when something is suddenly a luxury good, who can afford to do that? Um, and I think that there's always been kind of a truth to wealthy white women always have the most access to healthcare, whether that's like abortion access or concierge gynecology or doulas, like, whatever kind of thing it is, that's usually the demographic that can always kind of make it work, which is another, I think, systemic problem. What I also took from that quote with her is that when something is so costly and such a luxury price tag, it can perpetuate the idea that, this isn't like a large major systemic problem. It's just something that like people just sort of like frivolously care to do. And I think that is also kind of a danger with the price tag of this. But yeah, I do agree with the sentiment. If you think about it, it's like who can afford, $40,000 worth of care out of pocket, you know?
Yeah. 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 I also took the same two conclusions from that statement because I think it also alluded to this unfortunate tendency, which is when you talk about vaginal, vulvar, or pelvic pain, it's very often tied to just pain during sex, right? That's
Mhm.
often what people visualize when they think about it. But the truth of the matter is that it can impact your life in so many different ways, right? And go way beyond that. And I think it's just really problematic how, when you think of sexual health, as you mentioned in the article as well, it's kind of thought of as a mental health issue and therefore not prioritized as like hard medical science.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that I've actually always wanted to do a piece about what I think is it's kind of mislabeled and misbranded as and again, it's not saying it doesn't affect your sex life. It does affect penetration, but that's still a very male centric thought. It's a very heteronormative thought. And also it's chronic pain. It's just because of where it's located on your body that it's very sexualized. But pain is, like we don't sexualize back pain, even though you probably also can't have sex with back pain.
That's a
So
good
there's
point. I've
yeah,
never thought about that.
there's I think I do have a problem with the branding of it. And that's not to be like puritanical. It's just like,
Yeah.
it's the reality of people. It's like it's not sexual if you can't sit. It's not sexual if you're like, immobile or can't work. So yeah, it's a much bigger thing than just penetration.
Exactly. And it's actually funny that you say that because it's something that I think about a lot in this podcast because I obviously want these conversations to reach as many people as possible because I think they are truly necessary for those who
Mhm.
need them. And something that I struggle with a lot is like making it specific enough to actually catch the people that it's intended to reach. So in most of my communication, I talk about like vulvovaginal pain or Vulvodynia, vaginismus, neuralgia, like all the different conditions that fall under this big umbrella of like genitopelvic or vulvovaginal pain. But
Mhm.
the issue is with that is that again, like back to privilege, that
Mhm.
means that it also reaches like quite a small group of people. Like so that kind of argues for talking more broadly about something that people can relate easily to, which pain during sex, I think, is something that you can
Mhm.
more easily like latch onto as an idea or like relate to. But it's always a troubling balance of managing the semantics of it.
Yeah, definitely, because that is real, right? It takes an enormous toll on people and relationships to have their sex life be so disrupted and to associate something pleasurable with just pain. That's an enormous burden. That's a very isolating experience, and it's a very common experience. It's just not the totality of the situation. It's not a monolith.
And now a word from the partners who make this podcast possible and free for everyone. I want to take a minute to tell you about something that I'm really excited about because a little while ago I came across a company called Origin, and the more I learned and the more I thought about it, this is exactly the kind of thing this community needs to know exists. So today I'm really thrilled to announce that Origin is becoming a partner of this podcast. And I'm so grateful to be joined today by the founder and CEO of Origin, Carine Carmy. So, Carine, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us, and we're so thrilled to be partnering with you and this amazing community.
Thank you. That means a lot. So,
Yeah.
I want to start with you if you're comfortable, because what struck me about Origin is that it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of something personal.
Mhm.
Can you take us back to the beginning of why you decided to start Origin?
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking. And, I'm sure this story is probably resonant for many people listening. When I was in my early 20s, I had an infection that ended up causing chronic painful sex and really pelvic pain in general. And it felt like it came out of nowhere. And I was living in New York at the time, which is, the epicenter of amazing medical care. And I went to all of these different doctors, and no one could tell me what was going on with my body. Some people thought it was a skin issue. Some people thought it was just, in my head, which I'm sure you've heard before as well. And I even had a biopsy of my vulva, which was completely unnecessary. And
Wow.
so I was put on a regimen of different creams and approaches, and saw, multiple different OB-GYNs. And at no point in this entire journey was the phrase pelvic floor ever mentioned. Or really, the idea that this could be something um, that is also normal and common. I think I felt completely alone. And in your 20s, you're like, this is my sex life, this matters. And so unfortunately, you kind of just go in and out of learning how to live with pain. I ended up essentially living with this chronic pain for nearly a decade. And when I moved back down to Los Angeles, where I grew up, I reconnected with an old friend of mine, Nona, who's now my co-founder, and she was getting pelvic floor therapy at a local clinic after she gave birth to her son.
Hmm.
And she was telling me all about it. And she had known about this issue that I was experiencing and said, "Hey, I wonder if this would help you as well." And so I went to get care. And in 2 months, after 10 years, this pain was gone and it has not come back. And it was just life changing. So amazing, but also it made me so angry that, the solution was incredibly simple. It was pelvic floor therapy, non-invasive. I learned how to properly breathe, relax my pelvic floor. I used dilators for the first time, which helped retrain my brain about what was going on with my pain. And I also felt less crazy. Like this was a solvable problem that unfortunately, so many people just have to live with or are told they have to live with. And so I was incredibly inspired, as was Nona, by her own experience. And we partnered with our third co-founder, David, and a local clinical team to really build what is now Origin and bring this kind of care to millions of people across the country in both clinic models, but also virtually.
That's incredible. Thank you for
Yeah, of
sharing that. And I think your
course.
story is going to resonate with a lot of people listening because so many of us, I feel like, have that feeling of finally finding something that helps and then
Yeah,
thinking, why did no one tell me this sooner?
exactly.
Yeah. So I think my listeners generally already know the benefits of pelvic floor
Yep.
physiotherapy. It's something that we talk about a lot. So what I really want to hear about is what makes Origin different.
Yeah, there's a few things that we really invested in over the years, and we started working on Origin in 2018. We launched in 2020, and we have a couple really key core values that infuse not just our care delivery, but really the whole philosophy. The first is just the experience. We want our patients to feel incredibly safe, comfortable. We like to say there's no such thing as TMI. So many people are bringing a lot of shame and stigma and the societal pressures of like, the fear that surrounds this kind of care. And so we use a lot of beauty in our brand and in our spaces and in our communication. We want this to feel elevated, like you're taking care of yourself. It's not this thing that you have to do in a hushed corner in the back room of a gym, like where, all the other people are working out. Like, no, this is a real dedicated space for you. And I think there's something incredibly powerful when you either go to the website or when you're in a clinic, and you just feel seen and safe, and that this is finally like a place to actually just exhale. We talk a lot about just this feeling of being able to release and let go, and so that's one big principle that kind of integrates across everything we do. The second is that we are really committed to making this care accessible. It is incredibly hard in the United States to find a network pelvic floor physical therapy. The healthcare system is incredibly broken. Most providers can't take insurance because of a myriad of factors. And so we've worked really hard to get contracted with the largest insurance companies across the company. And now 50 million people are covered for Origin services. And it is really important, not just for our company, but for the industry, because if this is out of network, it's always going to be a nice to have, right?
Mm.
You're making a trade off. Like, do I get a massage or do I get pelvic floor therapy? Or, it becomes this luxury good. This is basic healthcare and needs to be embedded into the system. So, those are two of the biggest aspects. And I think the third is that we've invested a lot in technology to really support our patients. So we have built our own home exercise program, educational content. We have what's called Origin on Track, which is an app that really helps you with your care because we know it is amazing to get that 45 minutes one-on-one care, but then what happens between your visits is where the magic really, really happens and where
Mm.
care can, sustain itself and you get much more empowered. So we've invested a lot in the live classes, the educational content, the exercise programs so that you get better faster and that recovery really lasts.
Amazing. And the
Yeah.
accessibility part is definitely what makes me the most excited about partnering with you because like being recommended PT means nothing if you can't afford it or if you just
Exactly.
can't get to it. And that's the case for so many. And I know a lot of people listening are going to want to know how to actually get started. So how does
Yeah.
someone get a hold of Origin?
Yeah. So our website is theoriginway.com. We're also on Instagram at The Origin Way. If you're not ready for care yet, that's okay. We have so much incredible educational content that is free and available to all, also all over the world. And so, highly encourage you to peruse that. We take a lot of pride in investing in evidence based content and work with clinicians to draft everything. And so, there's just a lot of information out there that's not always accurate, or up to
Mm.
date or even, safe. And so we really want to be a voice of truth and support for our patients. And so come to our website. And if you're interested in booking, you can get started and book online, or call for support.
Amazing. Carine, thank you so much
Yeah.
for coming on for this. I'm genuinely so excited about this collaboration. And yeah, thank you. There isn't a lot of innovation happening in this space, which is exactly why I'm so excited and proud to be partnering up with a company that I think is doing some really cool things in this space. Pelva was founded by Kelly and her husband Doug, who built this from their own personal experience and created something genuinely new to help bring more comfort and pleasure during insertion or penetration. It's called the Hydroslix liner, and it's a cushioning insert that you place inside the vagina to protect the tissue and spread force over a wider area. So there's less pressure on the sensitive tissue. Kelly always says to think of it like a cushioning sole, but for your vagina. So it's a simple idea with just really smart execution. And what I also find so inspiring is that they do everything themselves: product development, manufacturing, all of it. And you can tell that they have lived experience with this. As an example, the ingredient list really reflects that care. There's no fragrance, parabens, hormones, silicone, or glycerin. None of the things that tend to cause problems if you've got any sensitivity down there. Again, I'm just so proud to be working with a company like Pelva, which I feel really aligned with, and I can really stand behind in my recommendation to you. So, if that sounds like something worth trying to see whether it could help bring more comfort and pleasure during insertion or penetration, then head to pelva.com via the link in the description and use code TWTC10 for 10% off your first order. Now back to the episode. Let's move to the New York Times piece, which you've
Sure.
titled The Vaginal Wellness Boom is Here. I think like the way it reads is slightly more satirical and quite funny. But
Thank
in
you.
it, you also talk about how the lack of research and knowledge and care within women's health more broadly
hmm
has created this massive business opportunity. So tell me, like, what prompted you to write this piece?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I think, as you mentioned, like before, I have a interest in looking at systems and kind of the confluence of a lot of different factors and how different industries interact with each other. And I like identifying a systemic problem just as like an intellectual challenge. And so I think like, not very sophisticated. This started last fall when I was getting a lot of targeted ads for vulvovaginal pain ailments. And at first I was kind of like, is this just my algorithm? Like like my Instagram is targeting these things to me and then maybe this isn't like much of a thing. And then I kind of started to dig into being like, okay, what companies exist? Like, why do I keep seeing um these types of products being advertised to me. And it wasn't necessarily just that I was noticing products being created and sent to me, it was the way they were being advertised to me. And so that I found incredibly alarming. So it was that I would look at something like a balm or a cream or a pill that was clearly in the wellness space, clearly just like an Instagram direct to consumer kind of company, but we're making very diagnostic claims. And so that is kind of what set my alarm bells off of being like, why does a pill think it can cure BV? Or why is there a balm claiming to help with lichen sclerosis? Like, why is this sort of blurring the lines of medical claims? So that's kind of where it started was I was very alarmed by the ads I was getting. And then I started digging deeper, like I said, and realized that, like, oh, there's actually a lot of companies here. And then I started looking into economic trend reports and started looking into it as like, okay, is this like actually a story? Or is, like I said, is this just my algorithm? And I ended up, coming across a few different market reports of the female sexual wellness industry, which is a lot more all-encompassing than just vulvovaginal pain. That could be for menopause, it can be for, like lubes, like it's a pretty broad category. But I mean, I can't remember the exact number that I quoted in the article, but it was supposed to just like economically boom over the next 5 years, like by the billions. And I noticed, like, in reading these reports in the fine print, like vulvovaginal pain, um, kind of infection ailments and probiotics were a factor in these market trend reports. And so I was kind of like, oh, okay, this is a thing. Like, this isn't just me. So that's kind of where the story started, was just noticing it as a consumer. And like I said, having my alarm bells kind of go off of like, not only am I noticing an uptick in the amount of companies doing this and making stuff, but I'm suspicious about their medical claims when they're a wellness product.
You raised one point, which is that a lot of these products carry all these vague labels like OBGYN backed and
Mhm.
evidence based. That kind of language is really setting women up for disaster. And I think that's what you were also alluding to in the article, that sometimes maybe there are products out there that are categorized as wellness products and may actually provide some benefit to you in managing symptoms, but you could also go in the other direction and actually use products that actively harm you. Is that like the core critique, that like the whole wellness industry pushes all these products to us and it's just basically impossible to see whether any of it could genuinely help, and it puts women in really vulnerable positions? Or what is the core critique?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary of it. And I would just add that I think that um, the deeper layer too is that, not to entirely point the finger at the wellness industry, because I also intended to point the finger at the lack of research and specialists being inaccessible and people getting dismissed at the doctor for, and being told things are all in their head. And so it's sort of like, well, you know, a couple things. It's like, first of all, it's cheaper to buy a product that you saw on Instagram than it is to see a specialist that costs $2,000.
Hmm.
And it people will always naturally take matters into their own hands when medicine fails them. And so as long as Western medicine continues to fail women, industry will fill its gaps. And so the critique is also like, I doctors need to get it together. Like, the knowledge has to exist and the research has to exist. And, you know, OBGYNs shouldn't be telling their patients, sorry, just use lube or have a glass of wine, because then what? That person feels ashamed and gaslit and then goes home and gets a targeted ad saying this will solve your pain. And then they're going to try it. So it's a bit of the like, it's not just that I think that the wellness industry um, evades regulation and is a deeply capitalistic endeavor. It's
Mm.
that also it exists because Western medicine is failing people for some reason. So the two have to be held accountable together.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really important nuance. And I think that the targeting especially is very problematic, right?
Hmm.
Because as you allude to, like you yourself have been subject to it. You also um mention a woman, I think a 19-year-old woman who was dealing with vulvar and vaginal pain, desperately searching for something that works and then getting hit with these ads for things like, maca root and omega-3s and vaginal probiotics. And it's just a problematic, murky area of, people who are really desperate, vulnerable, looking for solutions, like getting hit with these ads.
And I think that's also like, I loved speaking to, her name is Cecilia Martinez Plaza, who is one of my experts in that piece, who is getting her PhD in sociology at NYU. And so I credit her with some of this, but she was great to talk to because she was really, really kind of highlighted that people with vulvovaginal pain, especially, are vulnerable because, it's, again, finding knowledge from a provider is scarce and challenging. And
Mm,
it's also can be a very stigmatized, shameful thing to deal with. And so turning to, what you get online or being targeted an ad might be the only medical information that you're getting. And that's a very slippery slope, and it's a very kind of dangerous place to be. And I also think what I find very interesting, which is applicable to like other sectors of medicine, is I think that pharma and health is very polarizing in the United States. And so a lot of times people think that like things that they're seeing on Instagram don't have the same kind of profit motive that big
mm,
pharma does, but that's not true. Like a wellness company or an influencer is still making money off of what they're doing. And so
mm,
you can't inherently trust, what's going on in a targeted ad any more than you can something that you got at your pharmacy. And if you're just looking at it from a profit motive perspective. So I do think that is, also a concerning factor with targeted ads. But yeah, and then it's just, in my opinion, it's also just like an abuse of language. It's being like, as you said, like when you say something is OBGYN backed, it doesn't take much to be able to make that claim. And it doesn't actually really mean anything. It just sounds kind of medical. And again, for somebody who's really vulnerable, they might take that at face value.
mm,
So yeah.
mm. I think it's really important critique. And one thing that I was left with when reading your article is that you could also argue that there's some value in the market signal that comes as a result of some of these companies innovating and
Hmm.
bringing real time and money and R&D into building products that are meant to genuinely help those experiencing, for instance, pain during sex, right? Um, because if a company can actually build a product that does help some people, then that's kind of proof, and make money from it. That's also proof that there's this large underserved population who's willing to pay for solutions. And
Hmm.
arguably that's also the kind of signal that should attract more, serious capital, more serious research into the space. Like, do you have any thoughts around that topic?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because one, I mean, the reality is that medicine moves really slow.
Mm,
And it's really hard to get when you're kind of going through the traditional routes of getting things FDA approved or getting the NIH to fund a study into something, or again, getting OBGYN residents to actually learn all this stuff. It's a very slow process. It's very bureaucratic. And so I get that people don't like, you can't wait for that forever.
mm,
So there is room in the private sector to drive that as a priority for Western medicine, because if you can prove that there's, a market and that there's people who need this, and also that it can make a lot of money, I do think it's possible that that can kind of signal to the more traditional systems that something is worth paying attention to. And also, just because something is in the private sector doesn't mean it can't theoretically have good research, or, you know, if being rigorous is not like a prerequisite, like anyone can do a rigorous study and fund a rigorous study and even make a product that's very well backed. It's important that they just don't have to do that, but they can. And so I think that it's not that knowledge can't come out of the private sector. But yeah, I definitely did think about like, hopefully this proves that this is an issue. Hopefully, at least like it can prove that there's an audience for this, that there's a market for this, and that it's a problem. And I mean, awareness drives funding. So um, I definitely have thought about that. It's kind of a catch-22, it's a double-edged sword.
Exactly, exactly. Was there anything that you researched ahead of this article that didn't make it into the article, which you think would be interesting to discuss?
Yes, which actually I ended up turning this into the Substack post that I made recently, but I was also researching vaginal microbiome test kits
I
because I
wanted
have
to
a
talk about this, yeah.
yeah. So it was only mentioned briefly in the opening of the piece, a product
Mm,
that's a vaginal swab. There was a study by the NIH looking into gut and vaginal microbiome testing kits and how they're completely unregulated. So they're just kind of sold direct to consumer, but are held to no medical or legal standards. So I did end up interviewing a couple of people who were involved in the study. And again, it ended up getting cut from the article, but I did find it incredibly fascinating because, one, I would say a lot of these companies are tech companies. Like, this is not a medical device. If you're swabbing your swabbing yourself, or even like, this is big in gut health, you're sending your swab off to a tech company, and then they're selling you subscriptions, or they're selling you probiotics based on your results. And this is, in my opinion, they're making a diagnostic claim. They're saying, like, maybe this is what's wrong with you, or get to the root cause of your problems. But they're held to absolutely no standards. You're not going to the doctor to get a swab and then a treatment plan based on your results. And so I did find that sector to be very fascinating, and kind of being like, what, like, is this actually a useful tool? And something I will say briefly from my reporting on that I thought was really interesting is that I spoke to a vaginal microbiome expert and research, who, had told me that, like, for people maybe who don't have an ailment but just want like a quote unquote snapshot of their microbiome, which they also like advertise you can do, a single swab doesn't really give you that because the microbiome is a fluctuating entity that can be affected by a lot of different things. And so he had told me in a study, they swabbed, participants every day for 10 weeks to get any kind of semblance of what the microbiome really looks like. And so I think I found the whole thing very suspicious. But that was another sector of this industry that I'm very fascinated by.
Yeah, I am as well, and I'm so glad you brought it
Hmm.
up because it's
Hmm.
actually been a topic that I wanted to do a bit of a deep dive on because for many different reasons, but I think it's particularly interesting as well in the context of vulvovaginal pain because like a big trigger for persistent pain is like yeast infections, repeat infections, for instance. And from talking to people who have done these at-home testing kits, my hunch from it is that they are a lot more sensitive than like your average tests because they so often and again, this may come back to the supplements or probiotics or whatever they try to sell you on the back of it, but it seems like they more often than the standard test like raise the alarm of you have, yeast levels that you should take seriously and take this and this medication. That's
Hmm.
just my hunch from talking to people who have tried it. So I've been really curious to actually like understand how those tests differ
Hmm.
from what you may get like um in a standard general practice care. I'm not sure if you
Yeah.
looked into that at all.
I have. So, somewhat, this is the more like lay answer to that versus you definitely should speak to an expert, but, um, they are like a PCR swab. So it is very real that they do test for so much more than your basic like OBGYN. I don't know as far as sensitivity. I just know that like it is true that the range of stuff they test for is incredibly robust. I would say that my still criticism of that is certain companies are using the same swab as what is called Microgen DX. And Microgen DX is basically the manufacturer of this, and you can just buy it directly from them. Or a practitioner can order it for you. So they're basically taking this kind of advanced PCR swab that's like done by a company and repackaging it and selling it to you for more money at a subscription rate. And it's sort of like, so my criticism is like, yes, it is a better swab. Like it truly is, because I've also, as a patient, used Microgen DX PCR swabs, and they can be much more robust and definitive, especially if you're dealing with something kind of fringe. But you don't need to get it from like a
Yeah.
swab company. You can just order it directly. And then I think with that, it's not necessarily that the swab is not good, because like I said, I do think it is. It's that what do you do with that answer? Because what do you do with as a normal person being emailed a really robust list of pathogens and bacteria, and
Mm.
so that's kind of more where I start to question is like, you have to still be properly guided with a diagnostic answer into how to treat it and like how to interpret those results. So that's kind of where I think the bigger issue is. But yeah, I mean, I will say if you don't have other access, I do think the swabs, they are very good. It's just more the packaging and the results
Yeah.
that I don't know what you do with.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting take. And as I said, want to keep on looking into this because it feels like it's a little bit of a black box of like, how do they analyze the results? What is the basis of their recommendation? And can they even make those recommendations? I
Yeah.
think is your point, right?
That is more my point. And it's also what, when I interviewed, when I did the additional reporting on that's really just like the questions that people, like, that's kind of like the whistleblowing is like, how are you proving the swab is valid? How are you, interpreting those results? And like, it's also more what I find kind of insane about the whole thing is that, again, even if the swab is good, they are still it's a device that is making a diagnostic, and
Mm,
yet they are operating entirely outside of the regulatory system. And
mm.
so I think that's just where I'd say proceed with caution. So yeah.
No, I appreciate all the quite constructivist structures thinking that you brought to this conversation and to your writing. I think you are really making an impact by doing so, and we need your voice in the world. So thank you for doing that work. And I'm hoping that I can have you back at some point when you have even more pieces out there that we can discuss, because this has been super informative.
Yeah, I would love that.
So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for coming on.
Yes, of course.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did recording it. If you appreciate what we're doing here at the world's tightest community, you'll find a way to support the podcast in the description box below, either a one-time gift or a monthly contribution. And right now, monthly supporters get some founding member merch as a thank you. And if that's not the right moment for you, a rating, a review, or a follow costs nothing, and it's generally how other people find these conversations. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next week.